Mason Carter only meant to retrieve a pen that had rolled behind seat 14A on a flight that had just landed, but his fingers found something else wedged deep in the frame, an envelope never opened. Beneath years of dust, his own name was written across the front in handwriting he would know anywhere, the careful script of his late wife, Charlotte. Inside was not only her unfinished goodbye, but a quiet warning about the very airline he worked for. When the chief executive, Amelia Hayes, saw the date beside her father's initials, the color drained from her face. Stay close, because what Charlotte quietly uncovered will pull Mason and Amelia into a truth buried on purpose long ago. Rain fell steadily over Seattle the night the story truly began, streaking the windows of a maintenance hangar where the lights burned late and the air smelled of jet fuel and wet concrete. Mason Carter was finishing a routine inspection on a Boeing that Meridian Air had recently acquired for its premium charter route, a solid airframe with a long history and a fresh coat of paint meant to hide its age. He worked alone, the way he preferred it, moving through the checklist with the quiet precision of a man who had once been trusted with far more complicated problems than a single aircraft. A departing passenger had mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that a pen had slipped down behind seat 14A, and Mason volunteered to retrieve it before the cleaning crew arrived, if only to have one more reason to stay in the hangar a little longer. He knelt beside the row, unclipped the lower panel with practiced hands, and reached into the narrow gap between the seat frame and the cabin wall. His fingers closed around the pen easily enough. But there was something else back there too, something flatter, stiffer, wedged so deep into the structure that it had clearly been there far longer than any lost pen. Mason drew it out slowly, brushing away a fine layer of dust that had settled into the paper over what felt like years rather than months. It was an envelope, cream-colored, sealed, the edges soft with age. He almost set it aside for the airline's lost and found, the way he had done with 100 forgotten items before it. Then he saw the name written across the front, and his hand went still. 2 words in handwriting he had memorized without ever meaning to, the same careful slant that used to fill grocery lists left on the kitchen counter and birthday cards tucked under his pillow. Mason Carter. His own name, in his late wife's handwriting, sealed inside an envelope that had been hidden in an airplane seat for what the maintenance records would later suggest was nearly 7 years. He did not move for a long moment. The hangar around him seemed to go very quiet, the distant hum of machinery fading into something almost irrelevant. Charlotte had been gone for 4 years. He had grieved her in the ordinary, exhausting ways a person grieves, slowly and unevenly, and he had believed, in the way people convince themselves of comforting things, that there was nothing left of her he had not already found. A photograph. A note. A drawer of old sweaters he still had not been able to give away. But this was different. This was something she had written and never given him, something that had been sitting inches from his hands on an airplane he had serviced dozens of times without ever knowing it. Mason turned the envelope over once, twice, as if the act of turning it might change what it was. Then, standing alone in the hangar with rain drumming against the metal roof, he broke the seal. The first line stopped his breath entirely. Charlotte had written that if she was not brave enough to say this in person when she returned, there was something about Meridian he needed to know, something serious, something she had been carrying alone. The airline she meant was the very one whose logo was painted on the tail fin only a few feet from where he stood. Mason read on, standing beneath the harsh hangar lights with rain still falling outside. 7 years earlier, Charlotte had worked as a safety analyst for Meridian Air, a job she had loved for its precision and its quiet importance, the kind of work that rarely made headlines but kept people alive. In her final months there, she had noticed something wrong buried inside routine maintenance records, a set of flight control actuators and trim components listed in the system as certified original equipment, their paperwork clean and complete. But the serial numbers on the physical parts did not match the numbers in the purchasing records, a discrepancy small enough to miss unless someone was looking very closely, and Charlotte had always looked closely. She suspected the airline was installing refurbished components that had been falsely certified as new, parts that may have passed inspection on paper while carrying histories no one could verify. She was careful in her letter not to claim that the entire company was involved. She wrote instead about a pattern she could not explain away and about one name that kept surfacing whenever she tried to dig further. Ryan Brooks. At the time he held a senior operations role. In the years since, he had risen to become Chief Operating Officer, the second most powerful person at Meridian Air, a man whose calm public manner made him easy to trust and easy to underestimate. Charlotte was precise even in her suspicion. She did not accuse Ryan of forging documents himself. She wrote only that every time she tried to pull deeper records on the components in question, her access was blocked, and the block always traced back to authorization from his office. She had planned to finish this letter after one more trip, to sit Mason down and explain everything in person rather than leave it folded inside an envelope. But somewhere over turbulent air on that very flight, the papers in her travel folder must have shifted, and the sealed letter slipped from its place and disappeared into the gap behind seat 14A before she ever had the chance to send it. Not long after, Charlotte was quietly reassigned to a smaller role, and within a year she had resigned altogether. She never told Mason the full story. He remembered that period only as the season she said she wanted to slow down, to be closer to family, to stop living out of a suitcase. 2 years later, she became ill. A year after that, she was gone, and Mason had spent every day since believing he understood the shape of the life she had chosen. Now he understood there had been another chapter entirely, one she had tried to protect him from even as she was living inside it. At the bottom of the page, beneath her signature, was one more line that struck him harder than anything before it. If Samuel believed her, she had written, everything would be waiting in file number 317. Mason knew exactly who Samuel was. Samuel Hayes, the late founder and former chief executive of Meridian Air, the man whose daughter now ran the company he had built. Mason did not take the letter to Ryan Brooks the next morning, and he did not take it to his direct supervisor either. Instead, he requested a meeting with the chief executive herself, a request unusual enough that it took most of the day to secure even a short window on her calendar. Amelia Hayes agreed to give him 10 minutes, expecting a technical complaint about staffing or scheduling, the ordinary friction of running a large operation. She had inherited the company only months earlier, after her father's sudden death, and her days were already full of decisions that felt too large for the time allotted to make them. Mason set the envelope on the polished surface of her desk without much preamble. Amelia remained composed as she read, professional and unhurried, until 3 details stopped her cold. Charlotte Carter, Samuel Hayes, file number 317. Her expression shifted in a way Mason recognized immediately, because he had seen it in his own reflection the night before. The particular stillness of someone realizing the ground beneath them is not as solid as they believed. She asked where he had found it. When Mason told her, seat 14A, on the Boeing recently returned to active service, Amelia reached for her phone and quietly asked her assistant to clear her morning. Something else came into focus as they spoke. The aircraft Mason had been servicing was not new to the fleet at all. Years earlier, before it had been sold, refurbished, and eventually reacquired under a different registration, it had belonged to Meridian Air's original charter division. And the flight Charlotte had taken 7 years ago, the one during which her letter had apparently slipped from her folder, had been her final flight before she left the company for good. Amelia told him something she had never said aloud to anyone outside her own family. Her father had opened a private internal investigation around that same period, one he never fully explained to her. After his unexpected death, she had searched for the complete file and found only fragments, half a story with no ending. She had assumed, because it was easier to assume, that he had simply closed the matter and moved on. Sitting across from Mason now, with Charlotte's handwriting still visible on the desk between them, she allowed herself to consider a harder possibility. Someone might have made sure that file disappeared long before she ever went looking for it. She studied Mason for a long moment, trying to reconcile the calm technician in front of her with the weight of what he had just handed her. Running a company the size of Meridian meant living inside a constant stream of reports, complaints, and minor emergencies, most of which turned out to be nothing at all. This felt different. There was a steadiness in the way Mason presented the letter, no drama in his voice, no demand for immediate action, only a quiet insistence that she look at what was in front of her before deciding what it meant. It was that restraint, more than anything else, that convinced her he was worth listening to. Amelia asked him to keep the discovery between the two of them for now, at least until she understood the shape of what they were dealing with. Mason agreed easily. He had not come to her office looking for recognition or vindication. He had come because he did not know what else to do with a piece of his late wife's unfinished life, and because some instinct told him the truth mattered more than his own comfort in avoiding it. Amelia led Mason down to the company's older records archive that same afternoon, choosing a quiet hour when the building was mostly empty. They searched together methodically for file number 317. It was not there. In the digital index, file 316 existed exactly where it should, and file 318 sat right beside it, both complete and properly logged. Only 317 was missing, a clean gap in an otherwise unbroken sequence, as though the number itself had been carved out on purpose. That absence told Mason something important. Charlotte had not imagined any of this. A veteran member of the information technology staff, one of the few people who had worked at Meridian long enough to remember the era in question, confirmed that a file matching that number had once existed in the archive. It had been deleted using administrative credentials, the kind of access reserved for only a small handful of senior leaders at the time. Samuel Hayes had held that access, so had Ryan Brooks. Amelia's first instinct was to bring the discovery straight to the board of directors, to lay the missing file and the letter on the table and demand answers immediately. Mason asked her to wait. If Ryan truly had something to hide, alerting the wider company now would only give whoever was responsible time to erase what little evidence remained. Better, he argued, to gather what they could quietly, before making any move that could not be undone. It was the first moment Amelia looked at him differently. He no longer seemed like a technician who happened to stumble onto a strange coincidence. He thought like someone trained to investigate failure, to trace a problem back to its origin without letting emotion cloud the sequence of facts. She asked, almost without meaning to, why a man with that kind of mind was working a role well beneath what he was clearly capable of. Mason answered simply that after Charlotte died, he had stopped wanting any job that asked him to give more of himself than his family could spare. It was not a romantic moment between them, not yet, but something had shifted, a quiet mutual respect settling into the space where suspicion had been standing only hours before. Amelia found herself thinking about her father as they worked, wondering how much of what he carried in his final years had gone unspoken even to her. Running a company built on other people's trust meant absorbing pressure from every direction, and she was only beginning to understand how isolating that pressure could be. Watching Mason move through the archive with such patient thoroughness, she recognized a kind of discipline she rarely saw anymore, the discipline of someone who cared more about getting the answer right than about being seen to have the answer at all. Before they left the archive that night, Mason suggested a next step. If administrative access had been used to erase the digital file, there was still a chance the physical evidence tied to it had survived somewhere the deletion could not reach. Aircraft parts, unlike computer records, left a trail that was far harder to make vanish completely. Amelia agreed, and for the first time since her father's death, she felt as though she was finally chasing an answer, instead of simply managing the fallout of not having one. A realization struck Mason later that night, one that felt almost obvious once it arrived. If the digital file had been erased, the aircraft itself had not been erased along with it. Physical components carried their own serial numbers stamped into metal, permanent in a way that database entries were not. Modification plates bore installation dates that no administrator could quietly delete. In some ways, the machine remembered more honestly than the company's own records did. Mason and Amelia returned to the hangar together, working quietly after hours to trace the maintenance history of the very aircraft where the letter had been found. They pulled logs, cross-referenced part numbers, and eventually found what they were looking for. A flight control actuator had been replaced almost immediately after the flight Charlotte had taken 7 years earlier. The serial number on the removed part, still logged in an old paper record tucked inside a supplemental folder, did not match the serial number listed on the official replacement certificate. Charlotte had been right. The discrepancy she described in her letter was sitting in front of them, printed in ink that had not been touched in years. For a moment, standing together under the hangar lights, neither of them spoke. It was one thing to suspect a truth and another to hold physical proof of it in your hands. Before they could gather anything further, Ryan Brooks appeared at the hangar entrance, his coat still damp from the rain outside. He looked at Mason. He looked at Amelia. Then his eyes settled on seat 14A, still partially disassembled from the earlier search, and something in his expression tightened almost imperceptibly. He said little, offering only a brief remark about working late, but it was clear he understood that something had shifted, that whatever quiet arrangement had protected him for years was now being examined by people who would not stop looking. By the following evening, Mason received formal notice that he was suspended from his duties, cited for what the letter called unauthorized access to maintenance records. Amelia had not signed the order. She had not even seen it before it was issued. Ryan had moved first, quickly and quietly, using his own authority to strike before anyone above him could act. It was a mistake born of fear rather than confidence, and Amelia recognized it immediately for what it was. A man who was innocent would not have needed to move that fast. She confronted Ryan directly the next morning, asking why he had issued a suspension without her knowledge or approval. He offered a smooth explanation about protecting the company from unverified claims and protecting Mason himself from public embarrassment over what Ryan called an emotional overreaction. The explanation was polished, the kind of answer that had likely worked on boardrooms before. But Amelia had spent the previous night holding a physical part in her own hands, one whose serial number told a story no smooth explanation could undo, and she found herself for the first time since taking over the company unwilling to simply accept the version of events she was being handed. Ryan did not stop at suspension. Within days, he stood before the board and offered a narrative designed to look like simple compassion rather than sabotage. He explained that Mason was a grieving widower who had discovered an old letter and, understandably but mistakenly, built an elaborate theory around it. He framed genuine love as evidence of instability, turning the very devotion Mason still carried for Charlotte into a weapon aimed squarely at his credibility. It very nearly worked. Mason was asked to surrender his employee badge, and he did so without argument, without raising his voice, without pleading his case to anyone who was not yet ready to listen. There was a certain dignity in his silence, though it cost him plenty to maintain it. Before leaving the hangar for what he assumed might be the last time, he turned to Amelia and said only that if he was wrong, she should prove it with facts, but she should not let anyone erase Charlotte a second time simply to make the story easier to close. The sentence stayed with Amelia long after he had gone. That night, Mason drove home through streets slick with rain, checked quietly on his sleeping daughter, and sat alone at the kitchen table with Charlotte's letter spread out in front of him. His daughter's presence in the house was steady and simple, a small reminder of why he had built his life around fewer risks in the years since Charlotte died, though the investigation itself remained entirely his own to carry. Turning the pages over for what felt like the 100th time, Mason noticed something he had missed before, a faint string of characters written in Charlotte's smallest handwriting along the back of the final sheet. N317-SH/14A/SB229. He stared at it for a long moment before understanding arrived. It was not a secret code meant to be mysterious. It was a technical reference, the kind of shorthand only someone trained in aviation records would think to leave behind. A trail built specifically so that whoever found it could verify her claims without needing to simply take her word alone. Mason thought about how deliberate that choice must have been for her. Charlotte had known, even then, that a letter alone might not be enough to convince anyone, that grief and love could easily be used to discredit a claim rather than support it. She had built her evidence to stand on its own, independent of whether anyone believed the woman who found it. It was, in its own quiet way, exactly like her, careful and thorough even when she must have been frightened, thinking 3 steps ahead of anyone who might try to dismiss her. He did not sleep much that night. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table long after his daughter had gone to bed, tracing the small string of characters over and over, matching each fragment against what little he already knew about the aircraft and its history. By the time the first gray light of morning reached the windows, he had a working theory solid enough to bring back to Amelia, and for the first time since finding the letter, he felt something closer to purpose than grief. Mason spent the rest of that night working through what Charlotte had left behind. The service bulletin reference pointed to an old directive concerning the very actuator model they had already found mismatched in the hangar. The registration code referred to the aircraft's identity years before it changed hands and eventually returned to Meridian under new paperwork. Charlotte had not simply written down a suspicion and hoped someone would believe her. She had built a quiet trail of verification, something Mason could confirm with records rather than memory alone, precisely because she understood how easily a grieving husband's trust could be dismissed as bias. Amelia came to find him outside of working hours, arriving without security, without any of the visible trappings of her office, carrying instead a modest box of her father's personal papers she had kept in storage since his death. Together at Mason's kitchen table, they went through page after page until they found a notebook entry written in Samuel's own hand. The line was brief but unmistakable. C.C. was right. R.B. procurement chain compromised. Charlotte Carter had been right. Ryan Brooks was tied to an irregular supply chain. But the next layer of the story carried a twist neither of them expected. Samuel had not protected Ryan at all. In the months before his death, he had quietly prepared to remove Ryan from the company and hand the evidence directly to federal regulators. Ryan discovered the plan before it could be carried out, deleted the incriminating file, and somehow convinced Samuel that Charlotte had withdrawn her original complaint entirely, closing the matter before it ever reached the people who needed to see it. Two honest people had been maneuvered into doubting one another, kept apart by a lie neither of them ever had the chance to question. Mason finally understood why Charlotte had left the company so quietly all those years ago. She had believed, in the end, that she had failed, that raising the alarm had accomplished nothing at all, and she had carried that belief with her for the rest of her life without ever telling him the weight of it. Amelia sat back in her chair, quiet for a long moment as she absorbed what her father's notebook had just confirmed. She had spent months since his death wondering whether he had been a man who looked away from problems when they became inconvenient. Learning instead that he had been preparing to do the right thing, only to be outmaneuvered before he could finish it, brought a strange mixture of grief and relief in equal measure. It meant her father had not failed on purpose. It meant someone had made sure he failed. Mason reached across the table and set his hand briefly near the notebook, not touching it, simply acknowledging the weight of what it represented. Two families in different ways had spent years living with an unfinished story neither of them had chosen. For the first time since the letter had surfaced, he felt less like a man chasing answers, and more like someone finally closing a distance that should never have existed in the first place. Ryan understood quickly that Amelia had not stopped digging simply because Mason had been removed from the building. He called an emergency session of the board, hoping to strip her of operating authority before she could gather anything more damaging. He framed his argument carefully, accusing her of concealing a safety concern from leadership, of allowing a suspended employee continued access to sensitive material, and of risking the company's reputation over a single unverified letter written by a woman who was no longer alive to defend it. For a while, it seemed to be working. Several board members, uneasy about instability so soon after Samuel's death, leaned toward siding with the familiar face rather than the untested new leader. But Amelia had learned something important from the hours spent beside Mason poring over old maintenance logs. A letter alone could open a door, but only hard data could settle an argument beyond dispute. She requested an independent audit of a specific batch of components tied to the same supply chain Charlotte had first flagged years earlier. The results came back in stages, and each stage was worse than the last. 3 mismatched serial numbers at first, then 7, then 11 scattered across different aircraft and different maintenance cycles, forming a pattern too consistent to explain away as coincidence or clerical error. Ryan's composure began to crack in front of the very board he had hoped to win over. He pivoted to attacking Charlotte directly, calling her a disgruntled former employee whose account could never be verified because she was no longer alive to speak for herself. It was then that Mason, who had been sitting silently at the edge of the room throughout the entire session, finally rose to his feet. He did not raise his voice or lean into anger, though he had every right to. He simply carried forward a sealed, tagged actuator, the very part pulled from the aircraft weeks earlier, and set it gently on the table in front of the assembled board. "She does not need to defend herself anymore," he said quietly. "This serial number will do it for her." A heavy silence settled over the room. Board members who had spent the earlier part of the meeting nodding along with Ryan now sat very still, studying the tagged part in front of them as though it might rearrange itself into a more comfortable explanation. It did not. The physical evidence spoke with a plainness that no amount of practiced reassurance could argue against, and for the first time in the meeting, Ryan's confident posture faltered visibly. Amelia allowed the silence to stretch a moment longer before speaking again. She reminded the board, calmly and without theatrics, that the independent audit results were still forthcoming, and that the company's obligation now was to follow the evidence wherever it led, rather than protect whichever version of events felt most convenient. It was a simple statement, but it carried the full authority of someone who had finally stopped asking for permission to lead. The independent auditors confirmed within days what Charlotte had suspected years before anyone else took her seriously. Ryan Brooks had quietly built a network of intermediary suppliers designed to source cheaper, unverified components while presenting paperwork that claimed they met full certification standards. He had never forged a single document with his own hand. Instead, he had built enough distance through layers of shell companies and third-party vendors that direct responsibility always seemed to land somewhere just out of reach. Charlotte had been the first to notice the pattern buried in ordinary maintenance records, back when almost no one else thought to look. Samuel had been the second, though his own investigation ended before it could reach its conclusion. Mason and Amelia became the final two, the ones who finally connected both halves of a story that had waited 7 long years for someone to finish it. Amelia moved swiftly and without hesitation. Ryan was suspended from all duties immediately, and every relevant file, physical and digital, was handed over to the appropriate regulatory authorities for a full and independent review. It mattered, in telling this story honestly, that Amelia did not become some singular, all-powerful figure capable of dispensing justice on her own. She was a chief executive doing what a responsible leader does when wrongdoing surfaces inside her own company, escalating it to people with the actual authority to investigate and prosecute. Ryan was escorted from the building under standard corporate security procedure, and whatever legal consequences followed would be determined through the proper legal process, not by anyone standing in that boardroom. Before he was led away, Ryan turned back toward Mason with something between contempt and disbelief in his expression. "All of this," he said, "over one old letter?" Mason met his gaze steadily. "Not over a letter," he answered. "Over believing that if you buried the truth long enough, nobody would still be looking for it." Ryan said nothing more as he left. Mason did not feel triumphant watching him go. He felt something quieter instead, something closer to relief, as he looked down at the worn envelope still resting on the table beside him. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the unfinished story his wife had carried alone finally had an ending. Amelia approached him once the room had cleared, the two of them left standing alone amid a scatter of papers and empty chairs. She thanked him, plainly and without excess sentiment, acknowledging that none of this would have surfaced without the letter he had chosen to bring forward rather than quietly set aside. Mason shook his head slightly, telling her the credit belonged to Charlotte, who had done the difficult work of noticing something wrong years before either of them had any reason to look for it. All he had done, he said, was refuse to let her voice disappear a second time. Several weeks passed before the dust truly settled. Meridian Air publicly announced a full review of the supply chain in question, cooperating openly with regulators rather than attempting to manage the story quietly from behind closed doors. Amelia made a point of restoring Charlotte's name to its rightful place, ensuring that internal records reflected what she had actually done, rather than the version of events Ryan had spent years constructing to protect himself. A new internal safety initiative was established, built around a principle Charlotte herself had once tried to propose long before anyone was ready to listen. Any engineer or technician who identified a genuine safety concern would have a direct protected reporting line to raise it, one that could not be quietly intercepted or blocked by a manager sitting somewhere in the middle of the command structure. It was, in its own way, a memorial more meaningful than any plaque or dedication could have been. Amelia offered Mason a new role, Director of Reliability and Safety Review, a position with real authority and real weight behind it. He turned it down at first. He had spent years deliberately choosing smaller responsibilities, unwilling to let any job consume the time and attention his daughter deserved, and he was not eager to trade that peace for a title, however meaningful the work behind it might be. Amelia did not respond by offering more money or a more impressive office. She changed the terms of the role itself instead. There would be no requirement that he live inside the building or measure his devotion in the number of nights spent away from home. Dedication, she told him plainly, would not be counted in hours stolen from his family. Mason realized, listening to her, that she had understood something essential about him that almost no one else at the company ever had. He accepted, but he set one condition of his own. Charlotte's name was never to become a marketing tool, never reduced to a tidy story used to promote the company's new image. Amelia agreed without hesitation. "I don't want that either," she said simply. It was in that quiet exchange, more than in anything dramatic that had come before it, that their relationship shifted from careful alliance into something closer and more personal. 3 months later, the aircraft that had started everything completed its full inspection and returned to active service. Mason stepped into the cabin ahead of its first test flight, walking the familiar aisle until he reached seat 14A, where he paused without quite meaning to. Amelia stood a few steps behind him, watching quietly rather than filling the silence. She asked if he wanted the seat replaced, a simple gesture she could arrange without any trouble at all. Mason looked down at it for a moment, then smiled, something easy and unguarded. "Some things," he said, "deserve to stay exactly where they changed your life." He no longer carried Charlotte's letter with him. It rested now inside a small keepsake box at home, kept safe alongside the other pieces of her he treasured, not because he had let go of her, but because he no longer needed to carry the weight of her unfinished story every waking hour of every day. Amelia sat beside him as the plane climbed into the gray Seattle sky for its test flight. There was no dramatic declaration between them, no sweeping gesture borrowed from a storybook ending. She simply turned to him once they had leveled off and asked, almost lightly, if he might want to get coffee after they landed. Mason studied her for a moment before answering. "As long as we don't find any more letters this time," he said. Amelia laughed, a real and unguarded sound, and Mason found himself laughing along with her, something that had not come easily in a very long time. The aircraft continued its steady climb above the city, clouds thinning below them as the afternoon light broke through. For the first time in longer than he could measure, Mason Carter looked forward rather than back, no longer searching the past for pieces of Charlotte, but finally, quietly, ready for whatever came next. Some letters take years to reach the person they were written for, and some truths wait patiently in the smallest, most forgotten spaces until someone finally notices them. Mason never set out to uncover anything larger than a lost pen that evening, yet a single overlooked envelope changed the course of his life, restored his late wife's legacy, and led him toward a future he never expected to want again. Charlotte's quiet courage, carried silently for years, ultimately reshaped an entire company for the better, proving that honesty does not lose its power simply because it goes unheard for a while. If this story moved you, carry a piece of it forward, because somewhere, someone else is still waiting for their own truth to be found. Thank you for spending this time with Mason and Charlotte's story.